I want to welcome everybody today to our special event with Mindshare that is called Drawing on Anthropology, the intersection of visual art and social science. My name is Adam Gamwell, and I am one of the co-founders of the Human Science Task Force, which puts on Mindshare, as well as host of this Anthro Life podcast. Now, the Human Science Task Force, if you haven't heard, is a coalition of thinkers and makers and doers across intellectual traditions whose aim it is to help those who dedicate their lives to understanding the world to have more of an influence on it. Now, our flagship project is Mindshare, which is what we're doing here today. And this is a platform and a community that helps scholars and practitioners by bringing their research to life through curated conversations and video essays, podcasts, and more. Mindshare can also help you if you want to craft your research into new kinds of media, widen your reach, or amplify your impact. So we're booking speakers and storytellers for late summer and early fall. So if you're interested, please fill out the survey to get in touch. We'll have it linked in the comment section below. And so to talk about today's event, we live in a world where so much communication and learning and thinking is expected to happen verbally, right? It's not only the way to communicate, learn, and think, though. A lot of us think and process ideas visually, right? This is the reason that video is so popular and that photography and visual mediums are so exciting to so many people. And visual thinking can bring a lot of clarity and discovery and joy to a lot of people in ways of understanding and making complex ideas manageable. So our conversational MC today is Vyjayanthi. She is an ethnographer and owner of Rasa.nyc and is a lead researcher at the lab at Capital One. She's a lifelong student of Indian classical dance, which is super cool, and uses movement and choreography to connect. There you go. Hey, Vyjayanthi.
Hi.
She helps people connect in the deepest sense through movement, I think, which is really exciting. And actually, Vyjayanthi and we met years ago, actually, for this Anthro Life episode when I was in Peru and you were in New York, right? Yeah, so I'm excited that we're connecting again, yeah.
Amazing, yeah.
Yeah. And then I guess I'll introduce Kendra too, I suppose. There we go. Hey Kendra. And we're also talking with Kendra today. And so Kendra Allenby is a cartoonist for The New Yorker and other magazines, and she has a background in anthropology and sketch comedy, which is also pretty cool. And works with organizations to help make complex ideas understandable, clear. And again, visual thinking is one of the important ways to do that, as well as you do some really cool work kind of helping difficult topics become more clear, such as working with the Red Cross and World Bank. So I'm excited to kick it off with y'all. So thanks for having this great conversation, and I will turn it out to y'all.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks so much, Adam. And thank you, Kendra, for making the time. Busy schedule, as always. So I want to dive right in. We got a little bit of an intro to you, but I'd love to hear your journey to becoming a cartoonist, to start from the beginning, whatever the beginning looks like for you.
Absolutely. So thanks so much, Vyjayanthi. It's great to be here. I think the reason that I wanted to be a cartoonist is the same reason that many people who, feel compelled to make creative things start with this idea of just being kind of confounded that we're alive and that we exist in these bodies, and just this feeling deeply what it is to be human and being confused by that and being excited by that. And then all of that followed by the desire to process it and also the desire to share it, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it could have been many different things that would have all drawn on that first deep curiosity, but would have been different ways to share it or process it. And it just happens that cartooning was a really good fit. And I only started cartooning about 8 years ago. I studied, my background in anthropology is I have an undergraduate degree in it from Stanford. And at that time, I didn't think that I could be an artist professionally. I didn't know any professional artists. It didn't occur to me as something that could actually be my career path. And so it seemed smarter. Stanford's a good school, but it's not known as an art school particularly. But it's got great academic disciplines. And so I chose anthropology. And I've been grateful for it ever since. I feel like anthropology has made so much sense. And a lot of it's because if you are interested in art and creativity and understanding the weirdness of being human, spending 4 years studying humans and humans in society is a pretty great way to get a deep foundation. And I loved how it talked about similarities and differences, right? What's similar between very disparate groups of people and what's actually different, and to pull out those pieces as well. And then I also have this background in sketch comedy, which I loved, and in theater and performance. And honestly, when I moved to New York City 8 years ago, the idea of putting together a new sketch comedy group and getting, one, finding people that you vibe with creatively really well, and then two, getting them to show up on time to rehearsals. I didn't want to play that role. And then three, New York is such a busy city. It's hard for me to have time to do anything, let alone ask my friends to come see a sketch comedy show. And so none of those things felt inviting. And then the fourth thing is I love performance, and there's something I miss about not doing a lot of it. But also once you do it, it's done and you never get it back. And so if a friend or family member misses your performance, that moment is gone. And then I found that cartooning hits so many of the same content, scratches so many of the same itches, that you can set up the same situations that you would in a comedic sketch in a cartoon. It's just that it's so much cheaper to do. You just need a pen and some paper. And only I need to show up at my desk every day, which means I can control my schedule. And once you've drawn it, you can keep showing it again and again. And so I feel like there's just practical reasons why cartooning was a really good outlet for me.
And what's kept you going with cartooning? And kind of weave in, you spoke a little bit about the anthropology aspect, but how does it continue to show up, that background in anthropology, exploring these deep crevices of humanity? Talk through a little bit of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the things that I got from anthropology that I'm so glad to have, one is a deep understanding of ways to observe, right? So in anthropology, you learn concrete methodologies for observation. And I think that's really useful because as an artist, I feel like what I'm doing all the time is observing the world around me, either my own world for my own work or the world that clients are showing me for work that I'm doing for organizations. And so that's the first thing, just observation, just like spending a lot of time thinking about what are the ways to do that. And then wrapped up in that, the biggest lesson I've taken from anthropology is this idea of understanding your own bias, and that you can never take away your own bias. And actually the best thing to do is to understand what it is, right? I'm always going to be a white American woman, and that's always going to be true. And whether I'm doing ethnographic research or whether I'm drawing a cartoon, instead of me trying to say, oh no, I'm going to pretend, but I'm not, like I'm really unbiased, which is never true, I can say, no, I'm totally biased. I'm a person. Let me try to understand these biases. And then in cartooning, especially, you kind of lean on the biases, right? Sometimes your bias is the most interesting part of the art that you're creating, especially when you understand that it's there and you're able to work with it, as opposed to not understanding how it's impacting your art and your audience.
Yeah, I love that you kind of highlighted that aspect of bias. We can't get rid of it. And I want to see in your work, if you can point to how it shows up. So my next set of questions is really going to be about, walk us through, show us all of the types of work that you've done. And then maybe talk a little bit about how the output changes based on the client, and even maybe some of this aspect of how your bias, how you embrace your bias in your work.
Absolutely. And so I'll dive in and I'll show just a whole bunch of work so people can get sort of a visual sense of the different kinds of work that I do. And before we do that, I'll just throw out a couple other things that anthropology has given me that show up in my work. One is this idea of looking for things that aren't said, right? An anthropologist doesn't go and ask questions and do research and expect to be told any answers. They expect to be told lots of pieces of information, and then they need to see sort of what's underneath that surface level of what people are actually saying. And that also I find true with cartooning. If you just say what people say, usually it's not that interesting or that funny. But if you look for what they're not saying, that's the secretive part. That's the part that ends up being funny because it's surprising or it's enjoyable to see it stated out loud. So looking for those little insights. And then, I would also say anthropology gave me a background in how to deal with a lot of squishy information, right? Anthropology, cultural anthropology, deals with lots of, they could be looking at the way you leave the house in the morning. They could be looking at the way you talk to this neighbor and not that neighbor. All these little discrete pieces of things that can't really be quantified in one particular way. They can be seen in many different ways. And I feel like in art, that's also such a useful thing to be able to deal with a whole realm of squishy things and then try to make links between this disparate pieces of information. And then this idea of distilling things into insights and then figuring out how to communicate them. So as you jump into some of this work, a lot of it's about what's the process of gathering all the information, what's the process of coming up with the insight that's useful for that project, and then how to communicate it once you've got the insight.
Sure. And can I ask one little question before to tee it up? You talked about your sketch comedy background and just studying comedy in general. So you mentioned finding out what's funny, and often it's not what's said, but maybe what's shown, or the observation that you really have to sit there to unearth. Can you talk about how perhaps comedy has influenced and distilled some of this ethnographic process for you?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think comedy, there's lots of different reasons why something can be funny. One great reason is that it's just absurd. And I think a lot of what we do as humans is absurd. And so I think that sort of falls into this idea of watching humans and seeing what we do that's ridiculous. But also there's this idea of, as humans, we live in these unbearable tensions that can never be resolved. We are in our own minds, we're our own people, we like our time by ourselves, and yet we also need community and need other people. And we're often caught between those two extremes. There's so many ways that, we want to be our best selves. We have so many ways to rationalize being our best selves. And sometimes we're our worst selves. And then we have to live with being someone who is always both of those things, wanting one, sometimes the other. And sorry, could you remind me of the question about sidetrack there?
Oh no, you're on track. I mean, it was really about how comedy has kind of bridged that gap between the anthropology background and then your current cartooning output. How has comedy helped, if at all? I mean, I'm assuming I'm asking sort of a leading question, but how has it influenced rather?
Yeah,
your work?
Comedy, I feel like, you can get that moment of humor when you bridge that gap of that unbearable tension. So we're all carrying this around all the time. And when someone names it, I think especially stand-up comedians are very good at this, right? Some of their funniest jokes are them just saying something that's true, especially when it's something shitty about human nature. And you just feel so seen. And to have it be okay because someone's saying it and saying, yeah, it's not great, but it's true and it's always going to be true and it's true about all of us. Those moments of humor that are about these tensions that aren't going to go away, but they are surfacing them, they're naming them, or sometimes they're giving them a lot of cartoons give them a new visual metaphor. So you're seeing the same old trope, that same old question that you've lived as a person, but you get to see it through a different window, or it's aimed at a different person. And I think that that can just be a really cathartic experience, and that catharsis, that surprise at seeing that part of you in this different scenario, I think can make the comedy, and can also make the humor that is also healing in a way, or that's also like carries you forward to new insights or something like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I have so many more questions, but let's dive in so that our audience can get a taste of your work.
So this is a cartoon for the New Yorker. I'll read the caption. It's the deer is saying to the person in the car, well, of course we don't all freeze up in the spotlight. And the car is facing another deer that's tap dancing in the headlights. And I would say this cartoon is about a moment of absurdity, and it's also a moment about reframing something that we always think of the deer in the headlights as a certain thing, which is something that is related with fear and death. And this cartoon is saying, well, what if it's related to vaudeville and the deer's having the time of his life in the headlights? So that's a sort of inversion there. Here's another one that also appeared in the New Yorker. And the caption is, some people like coming home to a dog. Carly preferred an 8-piece funk brass band. And I think this one is a bit about empathy, right? Which is also something that anthropologists are dealing with. How do you put yourself in someone else's shoes? This one also goes a bit into the absurd to make the situation more larger than life or bombastic than it would be necessarily. But you get to have this moment where you're saying, am I the person? Do I want a Labrador? Or maybe it'd be fun to walk in and have a whole band going on. And then this is the last New Yorker cartoon I'll show at the moment. And it's two people sitting at a table. And one of them is saying, are you talking about the new normal of an hour ago? Or is there a new normal right now? And this is one that I did at the beginning of COVID, when everyone was all of a sudden shut inside their houses. And so it's that idea of how do you process change, right? And this is something anthropologists like to ask. How are people processing it? When something happens, what are the mechanisms that a person has and a culture has to deal with changes that go on? And a cartoonist is doing very much the same thing. We're trying to sell it to a magazine and get a laugh out of it, but we're also asking ourselves, how do many of my New Yorker cartoons come from questions that I have for myself about my own life? And then it's that nice universality idea is that if it's something that's happening to you, it's probably happening to other people, especially if you've dug deep enough to find sort of a broader human element to whatever the question is that you're facing at the moment. So this is one kind of cartoon that I do. These single panel, they're called gag cartoons, the New Yorker style cartoon with a caption at the bottom. And the New Yorker does black and white. And there's other magazines that I sell to as well, but the New Yorker is the most prominent one who's sort of known for this kind of cartoon. But there's a lot of other different kind of work that I do. And it all springs from that same seed that we're talking about, that fascination of why do humans do what we do? And why do we do it in our own world and head? And then why do we do it with other people? And so I'll do a quick walk through. One thing, if you remember nothing else from this event, I want to let people know that we think of writing as something, there's so many different kinds of writing, and we understand each piece of writing to be different from each other. And they have different purposes and reasons for being, even though they all look like words on paper. But you would, because we're so used to different ways of writing, you wouldn't confuse, a grocery list with a love letter, with a personal essay, with an in-depth piece of reported journalism. You would understand that those are different. It's using the same medium of writing, but they're conveying very different things in different ways to different audiences. And they have different powers, right? They each are very powerful. A grocery list is incredibly important, lists in general, but it's not the same kind of that a reported New York Times piece has. And it's exactly the same with drawing. You can have a love letter drawing, you can have a grocery list drawing, you can have a persuasive essay drawing, you can have a drawing that tries to convince you something emotionally, and you can have a drawing that tries to convince you of something, going through a really rational line of thought. And it's, at the moment, we live in a world where drawing is sort of relegated to children or relegated to professionals, which I also think is something to fight back against. I think creativity in general is often given to this idea of professional people who are paid to do it, and otherwise, it's a hobby, it's crafting, it shouldn't take necessarily that much time up in your life. And I think that it's one of my great life goals to push against that and say creativity is one of the best ways we have to understand ourselves, and also to understand each other, and also to be okay with what we find there. And I think drawing can be such a huge part of that. And different drawings do different things. So we'll keep talking about this as we go. But remember, the whole world of drawing is a whole world of communication.
This dance, as someone who dances, I often find myself between analyzing and synthesizing different movements that fit whatever the performance requires, and then a little bit of improv or a lot of improv, depending on that, to keep it fresh. So I wanted to see in your own process, from the concept, the initial ask, to the final output, how much of it is improv, how much of it is premeditated and kind of organized and analyzed and maybe even classified?
Yeah, this is my process, right? Which is also going to be very similar for a lot of anthropologists. Also, my process often involves a lot of sticky notes. But the initial process, right, is the idea of gathering all the information possible, right? So there's a research phase where you sort of open up the barn door and you pull in all the information possible. And this is true for my New Yorker cartoons, and this is true for any different work that I'm doing for a client or for myself. And then you get all the information in front of you. For me, it's really important to actually physically spread it out so I can see, right, I'm saying these lumps of weird different things, and what lines can you draw between them? What lines should you draw between them? And then my next step is to draw a bunch of lines. And this is the way that my line making process looks like. There's always a cup of coffee. This one's unfortunately empty, which then gets fixed because it gets filled. And then my line drawing is a combination of words and images, which is just how my brain works, and also how I've sort of trained it to work more and more. And so I move in between the two pretty fluidly. And when I'm writing words, I'm also drawing pictures. And when I'm drawing pictures, I'm also like thinking about the words that go through them. Because these are both things that we're really highly trained to do, right? Like there's the words, verbal skills are so highly hammered in to us in our society. I don't only live in the drawing world. I also draw from that verbal world. And the fun thing about the pictures here, I mean, these are not finals, right? So to bring any of these into a New Yorker cartoon or into an image that a client can use, there's going to be a process of tightening it up, of sort of refining it. And yet there's something so great about these drawings here, because the first drawing you do, and this is sort of what you might understand from dance or from comedy, right, is there's the most energy the first time you do it. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm constantly sketching as I'm writing down ideas, and I'm moving like this because your body reacts too. Like your drawing is it's like acting. It's like, you're involving your whole body because you are the person that you're drawing always in some way or another. And so, these quick sketches can sometimes you move away from them because there's a better way to explain the idea, but sometimes you realize your quick sketch caught exactly the moment of disgust or fear or nonchalance that you want. And so actually sometimes you wish you could just have this be the final because it's the most alive thing you've ever done. And I think that is right in response to what you were saying. I think there's the aliveness. On the one hand, there's something so useful about planning. On the other hand, you don't want it to not be alive. And so for me, what that often looks like is doing a pencil sketch, which is the planning. But then when I do my live work, I think I got my little video up here so I can just hold this up. I've got a nib pen and I've got brushes and I use live ink, and just the process of, these are fun tools for me because they always involve improvisation. I also use, pens. They're sort of a fixed width. There's a little less improvisation in the line by default in those, which is why I think I like these tools that have, extra improvisation no matter how much you use them. Let me see. Oh yeah, and so this is more the refinement stage. So once I have the idea here that's, in this freshest form, then you get to the stage where, okay, but there's many different ways to say that one idea. What is actually the best way? Who are you talking to? And then you do that sort of editorial voice in your head that you cultivate alongside this wildly creative voice. And the editorial voice says, yes, well, if you draw it like that, then the window's in the wrong place and you actually need the window on the other side. And then you could do a couple other drawings. And then after this, I do a pencil sketch and I add ink. And then I do final refinements on the computer. But the other thing I find about process is that the best thing I think you can do as a creative person is to come up with a process that works and then expect it to break down eventually, and you'll have to come up with a new one. And to have that not be a failure of your process, but to have that to be, just consider that as part of what you're doing and kind of a success. And you're constantly reinventing the wheel as a way you're constantly reinventing the relationship you have with your subconscious and how to coax it to do the things you want it to do.
That's wonderful. Take us back to sort of that overview that you had, that Venn diagram.
So now I'll just be sort of a high level. I mentioned that there's so many different types of drawing. So we'll just take a look at what some of those look like, because I know sometimes it can be hard if you haven't seen these different types of drawing to sort of understand why they're different. So these are the realms that I'm playing in currently. Cartooning, that big yellow circle is where the sort of New Yorker cartoons live, which is the ones that I showed first. And then I've also got these other colored areas where there's a lot of other work going on. So these would be the verbal names for them. And I'm not going to really go through them. You don't have to read them all. They actually get pretty complicated to explain. When you're trying to dice up what a picture does, there's not perfect terminology. And you can often just end up confusing people. But this is just to say there's lots of different ways to sort of slice up this basic impulse of using drawing to think and understand and present information. And on that, this is, again, very small, but we'll go through some larger examples in a second. These are different ways that this presents. So it's all lines on paper. Some of it's digital, so it's lines on, pixels on a screen. Some are colored, some are not. Some are with pen and brush. Some are with watercolor, ink, and there's some teaching and live presentations here. And what I want to say is there's similarities between all these drawings, but they're conceived for different reasons, and that's why the choice and execution is different. But they all fall under this bubble of how to use drawing to understand, think, and communicate. And it's because, anyone who's a writer, they know how to write in many different ways, right? And so they can write copy for their website, and they can also write, the email to their mom, and they can write all these different, they can write the novel that they're writing. And it's very similar with drawing. There's different tools you employ depending on your project. So this is one type of work that I do. It's called sketchnoting. And this is actually one that I did for the last Business and Anthropology conference that happened last year. And it was a 45-minute panel. And because of the way that my brain works, if I'm trying to take in information, I want to be turning it into snappy words and pictures that can help me understand what's being said, make sure that I understand what's being said, and then also remember it. And this is one thing I like about drawing, is that if I can't draw it, either I don't understand it or it's not completely thought out. And that's because for me, I use drawing as a tool for simplification. And this wasn't a problem with this panel was great, but sometimes you can be trying to sketchnote a panel and you realize that there's nothing to draw because they're not saying anything. And that's one caution I would have about our verbal culture. If we rely too much on only keeping things in the verbal realm, I mean, people have learned really well, how to bullshit their way around and say a lot of pretty words that don't mean anything. And so one way that I love using my drawing is to say, wait, let me see if I can draw it. And if I can't, we should really talk about what ideas you're actually presenting and whether they actually make sense. Here's some other, this is a digital version of that sketchnoting, the sort of, can you pull out the salient points and present them without oversimplifying the point, right? Because you also don't want to err on the side of making things too snappy and that you lose the actual content that they're trying to convey. This is another way. So these all look slightly different, right? But there's that same sort of idea. And then there's also this is more of a, like an infographic type treatment, right? Which is another, there's reasons to use a sort of crisper, clearer, it has a sort of a different tone of voice, this kind of drawing than, you know, necessarily like this one's a bit more playful. It's not like quite how you would see ideas laid out. This one, we sort of have more of an understanding. This was part of a longer piece that explained a longer concept. And then there's also this more erring on the side of more cartoony. This is a one-pager about New York City rent laws, which can be very complex and can drive you completely crazy. And the idea is like, if it's, you know, a page, you can sort of turn off at a page of writing on something like this. But with drawings, can you, one, make it clear, and two, make people want to read through to the end? And three, there's something about the visual mind that I think if you can create a really good visual, it can help people remember at least that visual, even if they don't remember the statistics or numbers associated with it. And this is moving into a different topic, into cartoonathons, if we want to talk about that.
Sure. I'd love to know, I mean, all of this work is so, like you said, it's varied. It's the clients are asking for different things. The needs are different. The output is obviously different. How have you been invited to do these? And maybe even talk about the first ever time and then how that's blossomed. Because in our earlier conversation, for example, you talked about using some of these drawings to unpack tensions, to diffuse tension, maybe in with institutions like the Red Cross and World Bank, if I'm getting that correct. But please talk us through, like, how does the client engagement actually work with such a, you know, out of the box type of approach like this?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating, right? I mean, this is not anything inherent to drawing. It's just inherent to the society we live in that has more well-trodden roads for verbal execution of communication than it does for drawing execution, which is kind of a pain because it means you have to reinvent the wheel every time, and you need to explain concepts that people are not familiar with. And it's not like I can just sort of list what I do and people immediately understand. On the other hand, it's super fun because you get to have more of a hands-on approach to figuring out what your career looks like and what exactly do you want to play with and how. So it's certainly, I mean, I have all those frustrations that any freelancer does of trying to, you know, find gigs, make sure they're the right size, and that, you know, any artist does in terms of like, you know, how do you charge for your work so that you can continue to be an artist full time, which is one of the reasons that I, you know, this stuff is so wonderful, but does take a lot of time. And so there's realities around that. I would say almost a large amount of my work has come from word of mouth. And so it's great to, you know, the more work I do, the more that brings me into different communities that have different artistic needs. And so the more I do one type of work, that can sort of lead to a slightly different type of work. And then also I'll say the New Yorker was a huge breakthrough for me. I first got published there maybe 4 years ago, and it's got a huge circulation. And so things like that, also some other magazines, I would do that part of my work no matter what, because I really love the gag cartoons, and it's really fun to do something for popular media that people, you know, will see and will have seen. But it's also very good business-wise because it can bring people that you wouldn't necessarily meet through my own network to see my work and to have questions and to say, oh, I wonder if you could do this. And one example, I'm working on this great book with two anthropologists from Penn, actually, Greg Urban and Mario Musa, and they're doing this book on how to understand culture in the workplace. And they brought me on originally to do gag cartoons for the book, which is, there's a wonderful tradition of this. You know, I can read their book. I come up with a bunch of gag cartoon ideas, like the New Yorker style cartoons. It's very fun. But then once I got into their book, I talked to them about doing a more conceptual drawing that talked about the ideas that they were talking about in their book. And that led us to a really fun back and forth where when you're talking about drawings that are about about ideas, right? Drawings that are trying to explain the relationship between ideas and trying to make it crystal clear. That kind of drawing saying, if you can't draw it, it's not thought out. If it is really well thought out, I bet we can come up with a great drawing for it. When you're in that conversation, the drawing affects the writing, and then the writing affects the drawing, and the drawing affects the writing, and the writing affects the drawing, because in the center is thinking, right? You're just thinking through all of this, and you're going back and forth between these two modes of thinking. So that's an example of they had this great project. They brought me on for the cartoons, and then I was able to suggest this other realm where visuals could jump into their project, and we've been having really great work in that realm as well. So part of it's, you gotta be hustling and scrappy and just trying to explain to people what you do and why it's helpful to them.
Oh yeah, 100%. I hear you on that. Freelancing is not an easy task, but super rewarding. So once you've gone through this process, you've engaged the client. Talk to me about some of these transformational moments. I'm always interested in the epiphany that comes out, maybe for yourself, but also for the client, something where you totally shift their perspective or even your own. Do you have any favorite moments where you experience that?
Yeah. And I think I'll jump to talking about these cartoonathons, which is something that's come up recently in my career. I've been working with, shout out to Sam and Pablo and Cartoon Collections, because they've been the group that I've been working with to do these cartoonathons with groups from the World Bank and the Red Cross. And the idea is twofold. One is the idea is that humor and gag cartoons are really great ways at accessing information that might otherwise be hard to approach, especially in social situations. And so I'll show a couple examples of that. So that's one, is how do you use humor to make put tough topics on the table. And then the second is how do you have engagement, especially when, a lot of these groups are working with very serious questions about, risk financing and they have conferences about it. And yet also, either speaker is good and it's engaging or they're not. And then it's really hard to listen to. And now we're all so much in the Zoom environment. And so the other thing that cartoonathons are doing is bringing live drawing of cartoons and having this imagination and this artistry come into these environments that are often very dry. And it sort of helps people's engagement. And we also find ways to co-create sometimes with the audience. And so we'll come up with a draft as the speaker is talking, that'll be shared with the audience. And then the audience will be able to give us feedback. And then in real time, we'll integrate the feedback and then be able to share it back with the audience, which is also that, co-creation itself is a wonderful way to be more engaged and, you feel listened to, you get to have your own gears turning. So let me show you some examples of that kind of work. So, this goes into the epiphany because I feel like this, as a cartoonist, I always say one of my favorite things is when someone likes a cartoon of mine enough to put it on their refrigerator. When it rings true enough that they say, yep, I want to see that for a couple days. I'm going to put that up there. And the real thing there is it's nice to make cartoons that I feel are funny and beautiful, but also cartoons that are actively useful to people. And that was also true when I was studying anthropology. I was always interested in applied anthropology. I was sort of going down a track that was urban planning and anthropology. This idea of these ideas are great, but then what do you actually do with them? And so with cartooning, it's similar. There's, a cartoon for cartoon's sake. I got no complaint with that. But in terms of the varied diet of a freelancer diet that I do, I love some of the cartoons that are, just a pun. They're just funny. They're silly. But then I love cartoons that are doing real work for real people. And that's the epiphany of doing these cartoonathons, is these are people who have very, very difficult jobs. And to realize that a cartoon that I draw could actually help them do their job better is immensely gratifying. So this is a black and white gag cartoon that I've pulled up. And the caption on the bottom is, no, this money is only for that one problem right there. And there's a man with money pointing at a woman who's holding a host of different words, which are problems. She's holding armed conflicts, climate change, floods, COVID, the economy, unemployment, mental health, access to technology. And the idea with this one is we were part of it was a Red Cross, Red Crescent conference that was talking about how to react in this moment of COVID. And what kept bubbling up was this frustration with the bureaucratic idea that you could have money earmarked for a single problem when all of these problems are always networked together. And no one's ever dealing with just the economy or just with COVID or just with mental health or just with access to technology. That's all wrapped up together. And it's actually not only is it nearsighted of the funding groups to be treating it that way, but it's a real blocker for people being able to get their job done. And it's also really frustrating with people who are working very hard. And so this cartoon, I feel like, was able to, one, sort of name the problem in a concise way. And then two, it was able to sort of have the empathy of how ridiculous is it to be put in that situation where you're asked to choose which of these problems you're going to go after. This is another example of that type of cartoon. And the caption says, just pull this down, "We put him in the field, but it didn't help." And so what I find with these cartoons, right, these cartoons are made for specific audiences. And so they, unlike the New Yorker cartoons, they're not sort of general interest. You might not get them if you weren't a part of the group that they were made for. But for the people I made this for, this was really helpful. They were dealing with this idea of there's an idea that somehow magically, if you put someone in the field, they'll have a greater understanding. And the truth is, that's only if they are going to have a greater understanding. Just the physically moving someone into the field, having them talk with locals, having them be, in the location, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be more empathetic towards what's actually going on with the locals. It doesn't mean that they're suddenly going to have the training to, as we were talking about, that anthropology, not just listening to what's going on, but listening to what's not being said. And so this cartoon was sort of about bringing that up. And then I'll show one more cartoon of this type. This one was, we had done drafts that people then split into Zoom breakout rooms to take a look at. And this was for a book release, actually, for The Future Earth by Eric Kohlhaus. And the book is about how do you look, we have so many dire predictions for the future. What if you were to think optimistically? Like, how are we hurting ourselves by only having a doom and gloom projection for the future? And so the cartoon here says, what if it was reversed? And it's referring to, there's a pie chart where the largest part of the pie chart says, energy spent lamenting a dismal future. And then a tiny sliver of the pie chart says, energy spent imagining and creating a better future. And so this is what we showed the audience. And the audience then had a chance to talk about it, to have a conversation, this sort of sparked things. And then the audience also had a chance to give us feedback, because we were going to do a live redraw, add to these cartoons live, that we could show them at the end of this talking period. And of course, what the audience said was, oh yeah, it's true, but it's depressing. And it's also, this is part of the problem, that we focus on this depressing moment. It's very easy to show the moment that you're in. It's very easy to pile on and say, yes, I know, isn't this terrible? And the real question is, where do you go from there? And so these are, quickly done, because it's just in about, the span of the 20 minutes that you've got in the conference. But I expanded the cartoon to contain the second panel, which is, in the second panel, you've got a different pie chart where the two aspects are reversed. And so the largest bright part of the pie chart says energy spent imagining and creating a better future. And then the sliver is energy spent lamenting a dismal future. And there's an image of people collaborating, and there's color brought in, and there's this idea of planning and figuring out a path forward. And so this is pretty simplistic, right? This is not rocket science in terms of what it's portraying. And yet this idea, what I loved about this cartoon was that even as a cartoonist in my position, you can get caught in not taking that next imaginative step. And I think always encouraging yourself to take that next imaginative step, because it's a drawing on paper. There's no risk associated with drawing what could be the next thing that's better or more interesting. And so I think that was a really fun cartoon to draw.
Yeah, I love that you took cartooning into the solutioning space. That's so wonderful. I haven't seen that, or I haven't thought. So I just had a transformational moment. Thank you for that. So I haven't thought of cartooning that it could be used in that way. So I do want to give the audience a chance to gather some questions and write them in the chat. But while they do that, I do have one final question. A lot of this work, you're indirectly teaching people how to think differently, but you also do formally teach people how to find their own creative process. So would you be able to talk us through that a little bit, and then also leave our audience with something that they can take to finding their own creative process if they haven't done so already? Anything that's worked, anything that's kind of a rare gem from your experience?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just to start, which I know sounds silly, but the fight back against this idea that only artists are allowed to create art, or only creative people have that ability. Everyone can doodle, everyone can draw, everyone can, just the way you write in a diary, you can draw how you feel and how you think and something you saw. And that's like a great place to start in terms of a personal creative drawing habit is just put it down on paper. You don't have to show it to anyone. You can show it to everyone. That's your choice. But just getting started. And in that, I think it's really good to listen to the voices in your head. Many of us, I mean, people's heads work in different ways, but a lot of us have several different voices in their head. And if there's a naysayer voice, if there's a voice telling you reasons why not to, maybe identify them and sort of set them aside, but cultivate whatever the sort of creative energy that you have, and then also whatever the sort of critical energy is. And they're both very useful, just don't have them talking to you at the same time. So when it's time to be creative, put aside the critic and say, all right, we're just coming up with ideas. No ideas are wrong. It's okay. We're just brainstorming. And no drawing is wrong and no line is wrong. I'm just getting it all out there. And then later on, often I'll put a couple of days between the creative voice on a page and the critical voice, because it's nice to have a space of time between them. That's one way to sort of differentiate them. And when you come back with the critical voice, that's when you can say, okay, I see what I did. I think that, this idea is better than this idea, or I like the way that I drew it here better than here. And you can have that sort of insight. But if you put the two of them together, the critic is just going to tell the other one to stop, and that will be less helpful.
So on that point, have you used cartooning, drawing to work out your own critical voice versus your creative voice?
Absolutely. And the other thing was a creative practice is you have to learn what you do that you like, and then keep doing that, and what you do that you don't like, and stop doing that. One thing that I've learned is often when I make drawings, this is rare now, but sometimes I'll make drawing, but it was very common when I first started. I'll make a bunch of drawings, I'll look at the page of drawings, and I'll think, these are all crap. I don't feel good about my drawings. I don't feel good about myself. This is annoying, I'm gonna stop. And then I'll come back a week later with that critic and I'll say, actually, these are pretty great. I kind of like them. The things that you capture when you're in a bad mood are sometimes the most interesting things that you do. And I think what I learned in that is just to really remember never to let the critic in when I was, first drawing, because he's only going to bring you down for no reason, right? So I just do the drawings, and if I don't feel good about them, I put them aside, and I don't, return to them until I'm in a better frame of mind. And then they are what they are then. But remembering that my tendency, when I'm really tired, to be overly critical is a good way for me to stop doing that, because I can just recognize that and turn it off.
Yeah, I think we could all learn from that mechanism you've developed. So audience questions, how would you like to see cartoon art evolving to support difficult conversations and meaningful engagements, especially to enrich virtual events, global negotiations, etc.? And how can we help infuse smart humor into serious processes?
Absolutely. I think the first most important thing is spreading the word and getting budgets going. And I think that's also important because what you want is more and more artists, and you want more and more diverse artists, right? We're in a moment when we're realizing there's too much white voice in the world, and we need to spread that around and have everyone's only going to be able to speak from their experience in a certain way. And that's true when they're drawing as well. But the only way to broaden that out is to make sure that there are more and more paying opportunities for people to get more and more experience and create this kind of work. And because I think this kind of work is useful in so many circumstances, I think, start talking with your organization. See if you have money to hire cartoonists to help you out with an event. You can always get in touch with me, and I can put you in touch with either other artists or myself. I think, and remember that there's a sense of play with it too, right? You're opening the door to things that you might not entirely be able to control. There's that sense of improvisation whenever you're dealing with the creative and the imaginary, and that's probably a good thing. That'll probably bring something really useful to your virtual event or the global negotiations. So I think talking it up and not being afraid to try to do it.
Great. On that kind of thread of online events, do you think a cartoonist would work in a Zoom conversation / meeting that's one of those difficult planning meetings where it's hard to identify core themes?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's many ways to do this, right? So the aspect of doing something live is really nice because it brings a lot of energy. You also don't have to. You can do things beforehand, which is to say if there's really difficult meetings, often with some of the work that we do, I mean, we get a brief beforehand. We get information beforehand. And it's just like, improv is often there is a scaffolding on which the show is built. And that's a group of agreements made before the show begins, right? And that's not what do you say, but that is that sort of idea of we've got 3 acts, this is how it's going to work. And so the same thing going into a meeting, doing live drawing, you want to know, great, who's talking? What are they trying to say? What are the themes we're going for? What's my role? Am I wanting to record important moments, or am I wanting to give the audience a new way of seeing the material? And so actually what I want to do is not record exactly what's going on, but come up with an imaginative visual metaphor that brings it home that people can walk away with. And so I think that's with any of these, there's like planning conversations beforehand to talk about what you're trying to get from the event and then how to best make that happen. And a lot of that's about just we have that picture of all the papers spread out. It's like, how do you get all the information in your head before, and then the meeting starts and then you go, because it's already all up here and it's already, been talked about. But I think it's very useful. A lot of the ones we've done have been on Zoom, and it's totally doable. You can have live drawing. You can have ways to, share it and update it as it's going. You can do, there's a lot of fun things you can do with technology now, actually.
That is a relief, because we're probably going to be in this world for a little while now. So our final question is, I love the idea of catching verbal bull. Any good examples that you could share in public? Because that would sure be useful in academia.
Yeah, I think it's good to start calling it. Too many examples to name, right? We all have been in those meetings where, and you know the people in your organization who are likely to resort to saying the same thing over and over again in different words and meaning nothing by it. I think the nice thing about sketchnoting, what I was showing some of those drawings, is anyone can always do it in any meeting, right? Just have a little moleskin, you can start drawing it out if that's something that's helpful for you to start thinking about that. But then when you bring someone in who's really good at that sort of graphic recording, graphic facilitation element, it is this cool exercise to say, if you're saying something that I can write down, that's an idea that exists, I can put it down. If you're saying the same thing over again, my pen's not going to be moving anymore because you've just said the same thing, and sometimes, yeah. And this is not to say, the important thing is drawings can also bullshit, right? Drawings can be feathery and frivolous and not be dealing, they can lead you down a garden path that doesn't actually get you anywhere. So the main point is, if you're trying to communicate, you want someone who wants to communicate and knows how to communicate. But I think because of everyone knows how to bullshit verbally, everyone does, and not everyone knows how to bullshit graphically. And so the people who are going after trying to communicate graphically are often just higher levels of communication, just because there's fewer people trying to do it.
Do you think it's harder to fib in one medium versus the other for yourself?
Oh, for myself. So I think overall, no. I think you can fib in any medium, and you can also be really truthful in any medium, right? You can fib with data and tell stories that are messed up with data, or you can tell a very straight shooting story with data. For myself, as soon as I started cartooning and then started getting better at cartooning, I just fell in love with it. So that's just my happy place to be processing, and also to be telling the truth, and also to be sneaky. Like I like being sneaky in a cartoon.
Yeah. Awesome. Any other thoughts or wisdom that you'd like to impart on us before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think certainly if you joined this talk because you are creative and you do draw, or you have a different mode that you're creative on, yeah, my strong hope is that you just put the pedal to the metal and go as far as you can. And whatever situation you're in, whether you're a student or whether you're in a company or whether you're work for yourself, what are the creative tendencies that you have, and can you get those to join you at wherever you're working, right? And are there ways that you can convince your colleagues to come on board? Or if not, are there ways for you to develop those skills within yourself? Because it's fun to be able to follow these. The creative and the imagination and also humor are they're a little shunned out of business as usual these days. There's sort of a seriousness about business that we have, which I think is a detriment. It's why bullshit, which can be very dry but is serious, is allowed to stay, and why a really good joke that really gets to the point is often not allowed in the room. And I think whatever ways you want to push that in your comfort zone is great.
Yeah. Do you have any resources, particularly for people who want to learn how to draw and sketch note and take notes visually?
Absolutely. I've got the one book that's easy to hand is The Back of the Napkin by
Mm.
Rome.
Mm-hmm.
This is a wonderful intro to drawings that are about ideas and about trying to explain ideas clearly. There's many other books. I don't know, Adam, whether there's a place to list resources.
Yeah, for sure there is.
So I'll throw some resources there because there are a lot of really great books on the topic that are fun to delve into. And also you can always
Very
contact me. I do teach this kind of information as well.
Awesome.
That's the best resource right there, right?
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're at time, unfortunately, because we could keep hearing your stories for so long. Adam, you had a comment and a book recommendation, so I will hand it to you. But thank you so much, Kendra. We look forward to seeing you flourish, and we look forward to seeing your drawings everywhere. And perhaps, how can people contact you? One last.
Yes, you can go to my website, which is my name, or kendraallenby.com.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you so much for this
Yeah, cool. Thank you both. Thank you, Vyjayanthi, and thank you, Kendra. This is fantastic. Just real quick, the book comment was not for me. It was from someone in the channel, but just he suggested checking out Effortless Mastery by Kenny Werner. It's for jazz pianists, but the suggestion is that it's actually a really nice way of when you're doing creative work to not get stuck in criticizing yourself, which actually, as a pianist, not a good jazz pianist, but as a person that plays piano, that resonates with me too. And so I think something else that I really took away from this conversation is that, there's such inherent creativity in anthropology itself, because it's an interpretive science, right? We are trying to understand the meaning of life, of how people, make meaning around events and processes and purposes and products they buy. And so sketchnoting and drawing and visual kind of language is so interesting, because all of us as anthropologists or social scientists are often taught to write, but not to think visually. And so I'm really inspired by both what Kendra and Vi have shared with us today. So thank you both for helping us think a little bit more visually. And so we'll have the links to Kendra's website and some of these books and resources on the Mindshare page, so you can keep the conversation going. Both Kendra and Vi will be around, so we can answer all your questions as we go forth. As well, we have a awesome event coming up next week, next Thursday, July 23rd at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The event is called it's with anthropologists, but it's called Ethics is for Everyone, and it's for anthropologists, including myself, talking about the ethics of doing research in industry. So we're super excited for that, and so you can sign up on Eventbrite. We'll have the link for it here on Mindshare. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Again, questions, comments, you can toss them into the forum and we will answer them and talk with you. So we appreciate any feedback. What went well? What would you like to hear more of? What you want to hear less of? And we will go from there. But have a pleasant evening, and we will see you all next week. Ciao.